One Sunday afternoon in August 1770, a small wooden boat cast an unexpected shadow in shallow coral seas. On the vessel above, explorer James Cook and naturalist Joseph Banks made their way towards an island at the very end of their world. It took only moments for Cook to give it its name. Lizard Island sits surrounded by the blue waters of the Great Barrier Reef. But these days, its reef-encrusted shores draw explorers of different kinds. Tourists seeking the solitude of an exclusive resort, and marine scientists searching for the secrets of a coral kingdom from the Lizard Island Research Station.
Island research stations on the Barrier Reef are our window on the reef. It is the modern scientist's laboratory. You're not going to discover how the reef works sat in a laboratory on land. The place to discover the reef is on the reef, and Lizard Island is one of the best places to do that.
200 years after Cook first sailed to Lizard, fellow Yorkshireman David Bellwood followed.
I'm from Yorkshire. I come from a place called Huddersfield, which is up on the moors. Cook was from slightly further north.
And his new socks. There are standards to maintain.
We both came to Australia for much the same reason, for a degree of adventure and to see the world. He was doing it as a navigator. I came here to look at the fishes on the Barrier Reef. I knew I wanted to do it since I was 11 years old.
So what species though?
Corydontid linei we want. Anapsis neoguanicus. Chris didn't kind of get this full quota yesterday. What else do we need?
Screwios.
Oh, Bodianus loxosonus. If you see any of those are wonderful. The Barrier Reef is a very addictive thing. As soon as you drop over the side of the boat and you see the bottom, you're hooked. It's one of those experiences that you can never forget. Your first view of a reef sets in your brain and it's always there. For me, I see the corals and go, nice, and then I see the fish, wow. Immediately thereafter, for me, all the questions come to the fore. Why are they so colourful? What are they doing there? Why on earth would a whole school of fishers just sit there for hours on end as if for your own personal pleasure?
David Bellwood is now one of the world's reef fish experts. After 20 years on the Great Barrier Reef, he's learned a lot of big names, but he's lost none of his youthful enthusiasm.
I'm constantly hunting for little fishes, so I see things that most people would swim over. So people would come back from a dive with me and say, "Did you see the shark?" I'll say, No, but I saw this fantastic little pseudochromis that was in a cave." I can spend an hour looking in a small hole and love it. It's just a case of tuning into different things. There's just so much.
Every one of these residents has its own story. And it's the hustle and bustle of the reef community that David finds so intriguing.
I view the reef as a city, and I'm trying to look at the jobs that the various fish do in this beautiful city. So some jobs, I would argue, are more important than others. If we're in a modern city, we were to remove people based on their names, it wouldn't have much effect. But if we removed all the police and doctors and train drivers and bus drivers, the city would come to a grinding halt. Likewise, on reefs, there are certain fishes that may have very, very important roles. The problem is we don't know what those roles are yet.
David suspects that the most important fish on the reef are probably the parrotfish, his personal favourites. As they bite into the coral, the limestone structure of the reef is slowly but surely nibbled away. The bigger the fish, the more they eat, which makes the giant parrotfish, Bulbometapon, his #1 quarry. But it's an elusive one, wary of divers and living in greatest numbers on the exposed outer edge of the Great Barrier Reef. Hunting down a school of Bulbometapon out here is the main reason David has come to Lizard this season. Lizard Island lies midway between the outer edge and the Queensland coast. From here, the many reefs of the Great Barrier stretch out for thousands of kilometres. The island's perfect location for a reef research station was first noticed by the Australian Museum in the early 1970s. Protected as a national park, both above the waterline as well as below it, it's changed little in the 2 centuries since Cook and Banks first visited. It's spring. For the island's ubiquitous sunbirds, the flush of new growth promises a good breeding season ahead. While the female sunbirds flit from flower to flower, the males engage in high-speed squabbles over courtship rights. The prize? Convincing a female to take up residence in the family home. Suspended above the ground, and out of reach of all but the most persistent goanna, these teardrop nests are one reason why the sunbirds do so well on the island. With the weather warming up, the researchers are also moving in. A regular visitor at this time of year is Jeff Leese and his team from the Australian Museum in Sydney.
Thanks for your hand.
We'll try and get you the other room later on when, what's his name leaves.
Yeah, okay. This is actually one of the better rooms.
For the next few weeks, the research station will be their home away from home, and the clear island waters, their office.
Lizard Island has changed a lot over the years that I've been coming here. When I first started coming, there was a single lab building. The sleeping accommodation was tents under the casuarina trees down by the beach, and that was about it. It's now grown up a lot. It's probably the best run coral reef research station in the world.
The station is run by a permanent staff of 4, and it's quite a job. Between them, they need to keep everything going, from speedboats to aquarium systems. Of the researchers, it's PhD students like Uli Siebeck who spend most time on the island. Uli's spent many a month here running her fish experiments.
It's mainly a field station, so most of the people do most of their research in the field and then come back to the lab to enter data into a computer or set up aquaria to keep animals in that they do their experiments with around the station. There's certainly worse places I can think of to work on. All the colours you get from the sand on the beach to the turquoise, green, blue colours just make you happy. There's always a place in the lagoon or around Lizard Island that is very sheltered from wind, so you can work pretty much every single day.
Out in the lagoon, Lizard's fish are always on the job. Though few are quite as meticulous as the damselfish, Dischistidus.
These fish have quite large territories, a few square meters, and they guard an algae garden. And they come out and groom this algae garden the whole time and just check that it's clear of any intruding species. So as soon as they see starfish, for example, that come in and march across to get somewhere else, probably, they come and will remove them. They can carry quite large and heavy objects, and they can barely swim when they do it, but they're so obsessed with it, they will do it, and they will move it even, just little amounts every time, and then pick it up again, and then try and swim a bit more, and that's just amazing. They seem to have a general dump on the outside of their territory where everything gets dumped. So they swim up to that certain spot and then drop the object. Whenever they have to go to the toilet, they use the same dump as well. They swim out there, do their business and come back in. Exactly what belongs into the territory and what doesn't.
For the scientists, every day and every dive reveals another glimpse like this into the once secret life of the reef.
In most cases, everyone comes back at the same time. It's very interactive. And that's the time when everyone's still really excited about their day's findings.
We're going to get for any rats.
They're going to have super
So,
yellow corneas, is my
well,
prediction. Yeah.
in some ways it's like a Christmas meeting where all the relatives come. These are people that you've met perhaps a year ago and you meet up again.
If it's similar to this tomorrow, which
This
would be
morning
right.
would have been good, this afternoon would have been...
We'll go tomorrow. They're still going to be there. This time of year is the time when you get most of your researchers coming, and that's because the weather is potentially the best. And this is also the time of year where everything's reproducing, when the reef fishes seem to do most things. Just on dusk, when light levels are getting a little bit low, when the sharks are starting to come out, that's when the fish start spawning.
Already, brown surgeonfish have been moving along the reef to congregate at one or two special gathering places.
I think they're going to be communicating to some extent at this time by sound, so they'll be saying to themselves and frequencies that we can't always hear, is it now? Now the moment? Now? Are we ready? Are we ready? Bang! And away they go. At the highest point, the furthest away from the reef, they suddenly turn round, and as they do so, they release the gametes. That moment of ecstasy for the fish is almost the moment of greatest danger. And that's when a predator could grab them. second they're released from the genital pore of the adult, the gametes are mixed, fertilization occurs, and from that second, the adults have nothing to do with their young.
Fertilized, but vulnerable, the fish eggs are swept into the gathering darkness beyond the island. Back on shore, life is a little more relaxed. With the sun over the yard arm, it's time for a break before a few more hours' work back in the lab. For Uli Siebeck, it's all a long way from the beer halls of Munich.
First time I came to Australia was when I was 10. On my first trip to the Great Barrier Reef, I jumped into the water and I was just stunned, basically, because there's so many colours, so many forms that you can't even start to remember any of them. At that time I wrote into my diary, I want to come back, I want to be a marine biologist, and ever since then it was one of my dreams to come to an island like Liz Island and do my research.
Years later, it seems most of Uli's dreams have been realised. This is her final field trip to Lizard before writing up her PhD thesis. Like Bellwood before her, Siebeck's first encounter with the reef remains strong in her memory. She's still fascinated by colour, and more particularly, how fish perceive it.
I think everyone that jumps into the water on a coral reef, the first impression they get is colour. And I was just intrigued, what do fish use those colours for? And we always think that every animal sees exactly what we see, and this is what the world looks like to everyone, every single animal and human. But that's not true. Every animal sees the world with its own eyes, with its own colours, that might be completely different from what we see.
As any diver knows, as you go deeper, the underwater world gets progressively bluer. Red light simply runs out of energy to make it more than about 10 meters down. But what nobody realized until surprisingly recently is that ultraviolet light, invisible to humans, can penetrate clear water for hundreds of meters. Not only that, but Uli suspects that at least a third of the 1,200 species of fish on the reef are able to see it as an extra colour.
It's very hard to imagine it because we just can't see it, so it could be like an extra spark, an extra glitter or something added to a colour that we can see, or it could be an altogether different colour, or even a whole array of colours.
Being invisible to us makes these secret colours hard to study. So Uli has singled out one fish, the yellow damsel, for further examination.
The yellow damsels look to us just yellow, and when you look at them with a camera that has a ultraviolet filter in the front of it, which means that only ultraviolet colours get shown on the film, then you can tell that the faces of those fish have ultraviolet patterns that we can't see.
But can the fish see them? Uli needs to prove that they really use their hidden spots in their day-to-day lives. She selects the territory of a dominant male damsel and introduces 2 new males into it, each in a clear plastic tube. One tube blocks the UV signal and one doesn't.
So I just look at who gets attacked more. The fish that has all its colours, or the fish that has only the colours that are not UV.
Already, Uli's results show that the fish displaying their UV colours get attacked twice as much. a sure sign that they are sending some sort of signal.
For humans, I think we have a bit of a bias in that we do so much talking that we assume that that's the main way of communicating between organisms. I mean, the advertising agencies know fully well that colour and images do carry messages extremely effectively. On a reef, I think it's the same thing. Fishes are influencing each other using colour. They're shouting at each other with yellows and reds.
Fish have the problem, they want to have bright colours in signals to attract possible mates. So how do you do that without also attracting the predators? And ultraviolet colours are really good for that, because you can communicate to your next neighbour, hey, I'm a really fit mate, come over. But the signal breaks down over a long distance so the predator can't see it. It could be called the secret communication channel that these fish are using when they want to talk to one another.
It's a secret channel probably being used right now by this male blue chromis as he prepares to spawn. Each male needs to woo one of the milling females down to his patch of coral to lay her eggs. His UV display would help convince her that he's the man for the job. Competition is so intense at spawning time that precise communication between individuals is essential if you want to contribute to the next generation. In a flurry of speed, sex and skill, the dead coral branches are soon festooned with an invisible carpet of neatly packed eggs. It's now late November, and life on the island is heating up too. The air is thick with the steady drone of cicadas, and their watery excretions as well. There's a rich supply of sugary liquid coursing through the rapidly growing vegetation, and the cicadas drill into the branches to tap it. The excess is squirted straight out again, allowing the birds to take advantage of an unusual shower. On lizard, nothing goes to waste. The carcass of a cicada is a bonanza for a green ant raiding party. In less than half an hour of teamwork, the cicada is butchered and the now manageable portions carried back to the nest. Even the goannas get into the act, though they display very little of the green ant's cooperative manners. The researchers at the station have settled into a happy coexistence with the natural world around them. But there are a lot of practicalities behind living in a postcard environment.
All right, who's crashing?
It's a very remote place.
Go, Roy.
The closest town is Cooktown, but once you're on the island and there's nothing. So you have to be very organised about going there, and that includes your food as well. The barge only comes every 2 weeks, and if you forgot, then you don't have food. Whenever I go to the field, people just laugh and say, "Oh yeah, are you going on your holiday again to Lizard Island?" We have a very hard time trying to explain what really happens. You're constantly doing physical work, and the diving itself is, even though you don't think you're doing much, it's quite tiring after 2 or 3 hours underwater. And then there are the days where the sun's not out. You get large squalls coming through that can last for days and days and days. But you don't have a choice. You've got your 2 weeks or whatever the time is that you've allocated to this field trip, and you have to do your work. The rain just hits you like a hailstorm would, so it actually hurts. Every raindrop hurts in your face. You're out there in the rain, in the wind, and it just makes everything harder. It just takes a bit longer.
Eventually, the rain gives way to strong winds that howl for days on end. While this makes life uncomfortable for working around the island, it makes it impossible to get out to the outer reef, which is exactly where David Bellwood needs to be, hunting for parrotfish. At least the break gives him a chance to walk in some famous footsteps. It was to the summit of Lizard Island that James Cook and Joseph Banks climbed in 1770. Desperate to spot a way out of the labyrinth of reefs upon which they'd run aground once already.
I think Cook and Banks would have had a very different view of Lizard Island. For Cook, it was the one chance he really had to get his crew back to England alive. Banks was frustrated. He saw lots of things that he liked, he saw the corals, and he in his journal says he was frustrated that he didn't have more time to study them. We've managed to do what Banks would have loved to have done. We have taken huge leaps forward in terms of our understanding of reefs, and not a day too soon. Reefs are under immense pressure around the world. Perhaps the most damaging is overfishing and dynamite fishing. I recently was on a trip in one of the most remote locations, more fish species than anywhere else in the world. And as I dived over there, I found damaged reefs. You'd hear the constant boom, boom, as explosions go off in the distance. If you add global warming to the scenario, it's even more frightening. If the suggestions of increased frequency of coral bleaching are true, we may be in trouble.
There's an urgency to the work on Lizard. So much of what we know about how coral reefs live and die has been discovered only in the last few decades of diving. It was only 20 years ago that a survey like this led to the discovery of mass coral spawning. one of the most spectacular performances in the natural world.
It is absolutely amazing to dive during coral spawning time. It's a very strange experience as well. It happens at night. You can only see what's in the spotlight of your torch. And then suddenly you come across this coral that you can tell is about to spawn because it's got all the egg and sperm bundles ready to shoot out.
From one end of the barrier reef to the other, countless billions of coral polyps prepare for action. How such tiny animals coordinate this mighty effort remains an unresolved mystery. Though we do know it is connected at least in part to water temperature and the phase of the moon. However they do it, their timing is immaculate. Within only a few minutes, every polyp on a coral colony begins pushing out its propagules.
You're suddenly in the middle of a snowstorm. Millions of little pink balls all the way around you, and it's just amazing. Lots of worms reproduce at the same time, so there's worms zooming all over the place, there's egg and sperm bundles everywhere, and you're in the middle of all of this, and all this action's going on. It's just look and can't believe it.
The water is thick with the seeds of the next generation, floating away like so many million tiny submarine balloons. Only once they reach the surface will the bundles rupture, releasing the eggs and sperm to mingle with their neighbors in the moonlight. The next morning, a strange and exotic perfume entices the island's residents to the shoreline. The tide has brought with it the pink blush of coral spawn, smelling uncomfortably sweet as it warms in the sun. For the coral larvae washed up, it's all over before it began. They're already dead, and the slick is rotting in the heat. But most of the progeny from the previous evening's sexual frenzy has already escaped the island, and another coral odyssey has begun. 2,500 kilometers of coral reef is on the move. When it comes to courtship of reef giants like the potato cod, surprisingly little is known. Grouper foreplay like this has only rarely been witnessed, and it's thought mating itself probably happens after dark. Of all the fish on the reef, only one species is known to never let its young out of its sight. Ever vigilant for a sneak attack from a hungry neighbour, both mother and father chocolate-dipped damsel must remain constantly on guard. But by far the majority of fish leave their young to fend for themselves.
The adult fish are pretty terrible parents by our values. They turf their young off the reef almost as soon as they're spawned, in some cases as soon as they hatch out of the eggs. So the little ones are out there in open water for a period of 2, 3, 4 weeks, depending on the species, and right from the start, they're on their own.
Jeff Leese and his team are trying to fill in this missing chapter in the life of reef fish. Just what do larval fish do? Where do they go? And how do they know how to get there?
As soon as the larvae leave the reef, they're out in open water. That goes on nearly forever, from the point of view of an animal that's only a few millimeters to a centimeter long. It's just a big blue mass. In some cases, it's a bit hard to tell which way is up, which way is down. It's the largest environment in the world.
Out here, a fully grown human can feel as vulnerable as the baby fish they're following. The first diver in this strange parade is doing nothing but keeping track of a larva that's no bigger than a fingernail. The second keeps track of where they're all heading, using depth gauges, compass bearings, flow meters, and a stopwatch. The little fish larvae have no such luxuries.
They are faced with a total lack of any adult guidance on how they should survive, how they should get back to the reef ultimately. So the odds are very stacked against any individual surviving.
One way we now know they beat the odds is with speed and endurance.
A few years ago, it was assumed they drifted largely as passive particles. In recent years, we've discovered this is far from the truth. We're getting little fishes, we're putting them in raceways, and it's basically like a fish equivalent of a treadmill. We've been stunned by the distances that they can cover and the speeds they can achieve.
They're going at 20 body lengths per second. Ian Thorpe or any other human doing that kind of speed would be swimming the 100 meters in roughly 5 seconds.
A butterfly fish or a surgeonfish could swim 50 kilometers if it wanted to. They're fully functional little fishes with a great deal of control over their lives.
As moths to a flame, these little fish can be attracted to a light at night. Setting traps around the island provides the animals to study and a measure of how many larvae are in the area.
It's important to understand what kind of connections there are between reefs. All the larvae who come into a reef at Lizard Island, did they start at Lizard Island or did they start somewhere hundreds of kilometers away?
There's a few stubborn ones here.
Up until now, we've had very little real idea of what the true situation is, whether the larvae on reef at Lizard Island are likely to be reseeding the reefs further down the Great Barrier Reef, or whether they just stay right around Lizard Island. My best guess at this stage is that most of the larvae coming back to reef originated in that particular reef.
With an endless ocean to choose from, it seems most larvae are using their swimming skills to stay close to the reef where they were born. Like a salmon returning to a stream, they tune in to secret cues to home in on their home reef.
One of the cues that seems most likely to be used is sound. Reefs are very noisy places. For example, waves breaking, parrotfish scraping the coral. The missing links have been, can the larvae actually hear these things? And can they say, oh, the reef's over in that direction because I can hear it's coming from that direction? We're now to the point where we know they can hear. We're not quite sure about the localization.
For a baby fish, locating the reef is not the end of its problems.
It's got to find this reef habitat that it's never seen before, has no experience with. It's got to negotiate all sorts of predators, a lot of which have the habit of hanging off the edges of the reef and eating anything that comes by. A lot of people refer to that as a wall of mouths, and it's a pretty good description. Once it's on the reef, it needs to find the part of the reef, the kind of habitat that suits it.
An anemone fish must find exactly the right type of anemone. A damselfish, the right kind of other damsels to live with. Before long, masses of juveniles of all species are crowding with the adults amongst the coral. The coral, too, is returning. Unlike the fish, wind and currents have conspired to carry a small flotilla of coral larvae to Lizard, perhaps 100 kilometers from where they were born. Not much more than a fraction of a millimeter long, these week-old youngsters now pick up an unmistakable chemical signal from the reef below. It's time to settle down. On this microscopic scale, competition for space is extreme. They taste and touch the limestone bottom, testing carefully, for they'll only get one chance to find the spot that will become their home for life. Within a few hours, the decision is made, and they begin to anchor themselves to the bottom. Over the next few days, the settled larvae undergo a complete transformation into tiny coral polyps. By summer, a whole new crop of young corals have begun the battle for their own place in the sun. After a long wait, David Bellwood finally has his perfect day for parrotfish hunting. It's not often that the Pacific Ocean lets you get this close to the outer barrier, or to spot bulbometapons so easily.
A whole school of them dead ahead. Beautiful. Look at them.
At over a metre in length, bulbometapon is by far the largest parrotfish in the world. And it has toilet habits to match.
To follow a school of bulbometapon is quite an experience. You're swimming in this murky water. You can see all the particles of poo just zipping past you. It's a bit like the beginning of some of these Star Wars movies. You know, when you're going into space and you can see all the particles hurtling past. Well, they may be stars or meteorites, but behind Bulb Metapon it's just pieces of old coral and bits of slime and mucus that's flying past you. It's a wonderful experience to see, but you also feel and hear it as they're around you, this crunch, crunch, crunch.
By following the school, David confirms that at least half their diet is living coral.
The critical thing on this trip, we know that Bulb Metapon feed on corals and on the reef. The question is how much. I'm trying to quantify the amount of material that they're removing. It's a phenomenal amount. The figure at the moment is about between 4 and 5 tons of reef per individual per year. If you have a big school of these things, it's removing vast quantities of reef. It's just like a herd of underwater buffaloes.
On rare days, these underwater herds can reach massive sizes. In 20 years of diving here, David has never seen one quite as large as this. Over 180 fish have gathered to feed and probably spawn on the edge of the outer barrier.
Bulb Metapon is a wonderful beast. They're very big, they're very slow, and they're very gentle. And I think Bulb Metapon plays an absolutely central role. It's basically the garbage collector of the reef.
For David, another resident of his city beneath the sea has begun to tell its story. It's a tidy end to another year on the reef.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
This would be a really good PhD project. If only somebody who knew what they were doing.
I guess I failed.
We now have a different way of viewing reefs. We're knowing how the fish return to reefs. We can understand how corals grow. This new perspective, in many respects, is based on work that's been done on Lizard Island. In view of all the potential dangers that reefs face, Lizard Island becomes even more important. Lizard Island has given us the tools with which to protect reefs. It's one of the few places where we have a long history. We can follow things over the decades. It's possibly one of the best understood reef systems in the world.